The wind was a sculptor, and it had carved Alara's life into a shape of stark solitude. It peeled the paint from her door, stole the warmth from her hearth, and carried away the whispers of the townspeople who called her a curse. Her small soddy, dug into the earth of the vast, unforgiving plains, was less a home than a burrow against the endless sky and the judgment of men. The land gave little, and what it gave grudgingly. She was out gathering dried buffalo chips, her knuckles raw and her back aching with the familiar pain of survival, when she saw it. Not a shape at first, but a disruption. A patch of wrongness against the muted browns and golds of the sere landscape near a jagged outcrop of rock. Curiosity was a luxury she could seldom afford, a cousin to the hope she had long ago packed away. But this was different. It was a stillness in a world defined by motion, an aberration that drew her forward against her better judgment. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into a man, face down and unmoving. His dark coat was rent, and from the strained fabric high on his back protruded the crude, fletched end of an arrow. Blood, dark and thick as tar, stained the ground beneath him. Fear, cold and immediate, coiled in her gut. Trouble had 1,000 faces, and this was one of them. The nearest town, Redemption, had already cast her out after her husband's death, their grief curdling into suspicion. Bringing a wounded, perhaps dangerous, stranger to her door was an invitation for the final, absolute ruin they wished upon her. She should turn back. She should walk away and let the prairie claim him, as it claimed everything eventually. She took a step back, the dry grass crunching under her worn boot. But then a sound. A low, ragged groan. Less a human utterance than the sound of stone grinding against stone. He was alive. The sound snagged on something deep within her, a filament of compassion she thought had long since withered. To leave him now would be a cruelty she could not live with, a final surrender to the harshness that defined her world. A tremor of defiance, fragile yet fierce, ran through her. This land had taken her husband, her reputation, her peace. It would not take this man, not if she could stop it. Her decision made, she knelt beside him, the scent of dust and blood sharp in the air. His breathing was a shallow rasp. With a strength born of desperation, she hooked her arms beneath his, her slight frame straining against his dead weight. The world narrowed to the singular, agonizing task of dragging him, inch by painful inch, across the stubborn earth and back toward the shelter of her home. The feathered shaft of the arrow a grim flag marking their slow, desperate retreat. The interior of the soddy was a pocket of deep shadow, the air thick with the scent of earth and old smoke. Laying the man on her own narrow cot, Alara felt a wave of dizziness. His stillness was unnerving, broken only by the feverish heat radiating from his skin. The arrow was the first and most terrible problem. To leave it in was to invite infection and death. To remove it was a butchery she was not sure she could perform. For a long time, she simply stood, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest, the firelight from the small hearth casting flickering shadows across his unconscious face. It was a strong face, etched with lines of hardship but absent of cruelty. She found a small, star-shaped badge of heavy tin tucked inside his coat pocket. A Marshal. The knowledge settled in her not with relief, but with a heavier dread. A lawman this far out, wounded this way, was not hunting petty thieves. He was hunting something, or something was hunting him. Steeling herself, she lit another lamp. The wound was high on his back, near the shoulder blade. The arrowhead, she knew, would be barbed. It would not pull free. It had to be pushed through. She sharpened her husband's skinning knife until the edge gleamed. She tore strips from one of her few clean sheets for bandages. Then, taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she began. She had to cut the arrow shaft short. The grate of the knife on would a sickening sound in the silence. The Marshal stirred, a low moan escaping his lips, but he did not wake. His stoicism, even in unconsciousness, gave her a sliver of courage. She knelt over him, her hands slick with his blood and her own sweat. "Forgive me," she whispered to the unhearing man. She placed the flat of her palm against the wound and pushed the barbed head through the skin on the front of his shoulder. He arched in a silent scream of agony, his body going rigid, and then fell slack. She worked quickly then, cleaning the twin wounds as best she could, packing them with a poultice of yarrow she kept for herself, and binding them tightly. Throughout the long, windswept night, she sat by his side, bathing his brow with cool water, listening to the twin sounds of the wind howling its lonely song outside and the strained rhythm of his breathing within. She watched him, learning the map of his face, the way his hand, even in sleep, rested near the empty holster at his hip. In his vulnerability, she saw a reflection of her own. Both of them were isolated, wounded by a world that took more than it gave. But as she tended to him, a subtle shift occurred within her. The gnawing fear began to recede, replaced by a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness. He was no longer just a threat or a burden. He was a life entrusted to her care, a flickering flame she was determined to shield from the wind. Sometime before dawn, his eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a stormy sky, and for a moment they were clear. He tried to speak, his voice a dry croak. "Water," he managed. She held a cup to his lips, her hand steady. He drank, then his gaze fell upon her, holding it for a long moment. There was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, weary gratitude. "Alara," she said, her own voice quiet. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of understanding passing between them before the fever pulled him back under. Dawn broke cold and gray, the light seeping into the soddy like watered-down milk. The wind had died, leaving behind a silence that felt fragile, breakable. The Marshal. She had decided to think of him as Silas, a name she'd read once that sounded as solid and dependable as he looked, was weak but lucid. He had managed to sit up, leaning his uninjured shoulder against the cool earth wall. His gaze followed her as she moved about the small room, stoking the fire, putting a kettle on. "They'll come," he said, his voice a low rasp but clear. It was not a question. Alara paused, the iron poker still in her hand. She knew he was right. Trouble, once invited, rarely left without taking something. She merely nodded, her jaw tight. Just as the words settled between them, the sound came. The rhythmic thud of horses' hooves on hard-packed earth, growing steadily closer. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. She darted to the single small window, peering through a crack in the shutter. 3 riders. They sat their horses with a slouching arrogance, their faces hard and unsparing in the morning light. The man in the lead had a predatory stillness, his eyes sweeping over her small homestead with dismissive contempt. Bounty hunters. Their greed was a palpable aura. Silas was already reaching for his gun belt, which lay on a small crate beside the cot. His movements were slow, agonizingly so. He would be no match for 3 of them. The lead rider, a man with a scarred lip and cruel eyes, dismounted and strode to her door. He did not knock. He hammered his fist against the wood. "Woman, we're looking for a man. Rode this way. An escaped murderer. There's a price on his head." His voice was laced with an oily confidence. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but as she looked from the door to the vulnerable man behind her, a cold resolve settled over her. She had not saved him only to feed him to these wolves. She opened the door just enough to block the entrance with her body. "I've seen no one," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Only the wind and the dust." The man, Jedediah, smiled, a humorless twisting of his scarred lip. "Is that so? A lone woman out here sees nothing? Funny. We tracked him right to these rocks." He gestured with his chin toward the outcrop where she had found Silas. He knew. Her denial was useless. He took a step forward, intending to push his way inside. In that instant, Alara's world narrowed to the threshold of her home. This small space, this burrow of earth and grass, was all she had. It was her sanctuary, and he would not violate it. As another of the men moved to shove past her, instinct took over. The iron poker from the hearth was still in her hand, heavy and solid. With a cry that was part fear and part rage, she swung it, catching the second man squarely on the side of his head. He staggered back with a grunt of surprise and pain, collapsing to the ground. The sudden violence created a vital moment of chaos. Jedediah, momentarily distracted, turned toward his fallen man. It was all the time Silas needed. A single, deafening shot exploded in the confines of the soddy. Jedediah froze, his eyes wide, a dark stain blossoming on his chest before he crumpled to the dirt. The third man, seeing his leader fall, wasted no time. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a frantic gallop, disappearing back into the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence that descended was absolute, deeper and more profound than the quiet that had preceded it. It was the silence of after, the hollow ringing left behind by violence. Smoke from the gunshot hung in the air, acrid and sharp. Outside, one man lay dead, another groaning on the ground. Inside, Silas slumped back against the wall, his face pale with exhaustion, his pistol still held loosely in his hand. Fresh blood was seeping through the bandage on his shoulder. Without a word, Alara shut the door, plunging the room back into its familiar dimness. The poker fell from her numb fingers, clattering on the packed earth floor. She did not tremble. She felt strangely, terrifyingly calm. She knelt by Silas, gently taking the gun from his grasp and setting it aside. She examined his wound, her touch now practiced and sure. The exertion had reopened it, but the bleeding was not severe. As she worked, pressing a clean cloth to the wound, their eyes met. His gaze held no pity, no surprise. It held a quiet, profound respect that warmed her more than any fire. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low and rough. She finished tying the new bandage, her movements deliberate. "We saved each other," she replied, and the truth of it settled between them, solid and real. He trusted her then, telling her in short, clipped sentences about the man he'd been hunting, Jedediah's own brother, a killer who had murdered Silas's partner. The bounty on Silas had been a lie, a fabrication to turn settlers against him and claim vengeance. He was the hunter, not the hunted. As he spoke, Alara looked past him, through the small window to the horizon. The sun was climbing, spilling golden light across the prairie, burning away the cold gray of the dawn. The world outside her door was the same unforgiving expanse it had always been, but she was no longer the same woman. Strength, she now understood, was not the absence of fear. It was the choice to act in its suffocating presence. She was not Alara the cursed, Alara the widow, Alara the shunned. She was Alara who had faced down death and had not broken. "I'll need to rest," Silas said, his voice softer now. "Just for a few days. Until I can ride." It was a question, but it felt like an offering. He was asking for shelter, but he was offering partnership, a shared defense against the world. She stood and walked to the hearth, her movements fluid and purposeful. She placed the kettle back over the flames. The simple, domestic act felt different now, imbued with a new significance. It was not a gesture of lonely survival, but the foundation of something being built. "The water will be hot soon," she said, looking back at him. A small, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time. In the growing light of the new day, the small soddy did not feel like a burrow, felt like a fortress, felt like a home.